The Second World War stands as the most pivotal clash humanity has ever endured. It was not merely a struggle of nations, but of visions of what the future of mankind could become. In our reality, the Allies triumphed, the fascist regimes were crushed, and a new order, built on democratic ideals, took shape. But history is never inevitable, and the fate of the world rested on fragile chains of events that could have turned differently with only a handful of choices. Imagine for a moment that the tide shifted. The Third Reich rose not as a collapsing empire, but as a dominant power, stretching across Europe. Instead of the swastika falling in the ruins of Berlin, it flew proudly above the capitals of Paris, London, and Warsaw. Instead of a suicide in a bunker, Hitler lived to see his empire fulfilled. The question is not simply what battles would have been fought or what strategies used, but what the world itself would look like under this shadow. What would it mean for culture, for technology, for humanity if the Reich had survived and thrived? The Allies built a post-war world based on cooperation, trade, and eventual globalization. But in this alternate story, the world is unified by something far darker, a unity not of freedom, but of submission. At first, resistance movements would surely rise from every corner. The French Maquis, the Polish underground, the partisans in the Balkans. Yet against the overwhelming resources of a German empire that now controlled industry, agriculture, and transport across a continent, their fight would be brutal and short-lived. The Reich had already perfected the art of crushing dissent through terror, starvation, and the merciless destruction of entire towns. Over time, even the proudest fighters would see their strength wither as blockades starved them and reprisals burned their families' homes to ash. The Soviet Union, once a colossus, would be forced back into the frozen East. Cut off from its breadbasket, its cities, its factories, the Red Army would no longer be the unstoppable force that pushed to Berlin in our history. Instead, it would dwindle into scattered remnants, pressed beyond the Urals, reduced to guerrilla bands harassing German supply lines, yet unable to mount a true counterattack. The dream of communism spreading through Eastern Europe would end in this alternate world, buried beneath the boots of German divisions. Yet this world is not merely about war. It is about ideology. The Nazis never intended simply to conquer territory. They sought to reshape civilization itself. Their vision was to erase centuries of European tradition, Enlightenment values, Christianity, and democracy, replacing them with a racial hierarchy where one group would rule and all others would submit. To imagine their victory is to imagine a civilization where the very concept of human equality ceases to exist. This is the scenario we will explore. A world where Hitler's new order took root. A Europe reorganized not by cooperation, but by bloodlines. A society that taught children not of freedom or compassion, but of duty to race and state above all. To picture this new Europe, we must first understand the core of the ideology that drove the Reich. It was not politics as usual, it was not left or right as we commonly frame it, but something entirely new. It blended authoritarian control with racial mythology to create a system where every law, every institution, every life was measured against the standard of racial purity. At the top of this imagined hierarchy stood the so-called Aryans. For the Reich, this meant pure Germans of northern blood, tall, light-skinned, disciplined, and loyal. Below them, but still acceptable, were certain Western Europeans, such as the Dutch, the British, and the Northern French. The Japanese, too, were granted the status of honorary Aryans, a decision born out of political convenience and a grudging admiration for their militaristic culture. Further down the ladder laid the Southern Europeans, Spaniards, Italians, Greeks. They were tolerated, yet looked upon as naturally inferior, considered lazy and less disciplined. This disdain would create endless tension within the supposed fascist brotherhood. In truth, the German Reich would have viewed these allies as expendable pawns rather than equals. And then, at the bottom, laid the vast masses, the Untermensch, Slavs, Jews, Roma, and countless others whom the regime declared unworthy of life itself. In our real history, these groups faced horrific persecution and genocide. In the alternate world we are imagining, this horror expands to an unimaginable scale. Entire nations would be erased, not simply politically, but physically, their lands cleared for German settlers, their histories torched, their cultures forbidden even to be remembered. Hitler often admired the way the United States expanded westward, pushing native peoples off their ancestral lands. He saw this not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint. The plan for Eastern Europe was the same, only far more ruthless. Tens of millions starved through deliberate policies, entire villages erased through famine, disease, and execution, until only the land remained. Once emptied, it would be filled with German colonists farming the fertile plains of Ukraine and southern Russia, feeding the empire for generations to come. This was not a short-term vision, but a centuries-long project. The Reich planned for a future where, after generations, the map of Europe no longer showed Poles, Russians, or Ukrainians at all. Instead, the names would vanish, replaced by German towns, German roads, German farms, stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. Children born to the few surviving Slavs deemed fit for assimilation would be taken from their families, raised in German schools, taught to forget their ancestry, and forced to breed only with approved Aryan partners. The goal was nothing less than the complete erasure of entire peoples. In such a world, the concept of Europe as we know it ceases to exist. Instead of a patchwork of cultures, languages, and histories, we would see a uniform empire defined only by its loyalty to the Reich. Art, literature, religion, and even memory would be reshaped or destroyed. Generations would grow up never knowing that nations like Poland once stood proud, never learning of the Enlightenment, never hearing the names of resistance fighters who died to preserve freedom. And as the empire stabilized, it would not only conquer territory, it would conquer identity. Being European would mean nothing without being German. The Reich would decide who is allowed to exist, who is allowed to reproduce, who is allowed to speak. Every aspect of life would be dictated by a state that saw itself not as a government, but as a new civilization destined to rule for 1,000 years.
With the continent subdued, the Reich would not stop at political and racial domination. It would turn its gaze toward culture, religion, and the human spirit itself. For Hitler and his circle, the greatest threat was not only the people they deemed inferior, but the very ideas that gave Europeans a sense of freedom and individuality. Christianity, with its teaching of compassion and its loyalty to a higher power beyond the state, was considered an obstacle to absolute control. Though born a Catholic, Hitler grew to despise the Church, seeing it as weak and foreign, a tool that softened the will of nations. In our alternate path, once the war ended, the uneasy agreements with the Vatican and other religious authorities would be shattered. Monasteries and cathedrals would be closed, clergy imprisoned, propaganda unleashed to turn populations against their priests. Faith itself would be painted as a dangerous relic, a poison that distracted the Aryan race from its destiny. Slowly but surely, the cross would be replaced with the swastika. Children would be raised to see loyalty to race and Reich as the only sacred calling. This replacement of religion would not be limited to Christianity alone. Every system of thought that drew allegiance away from the state would be targeted. Philosophy, science, art, all would be reshaped into tools of ideology. Schools would no longer teach the works of Enlightenment thinkers or the values of liberty, but rather lessons in racial superiority, military discipline, and obedience. Generations would grow up never questioning authority, because to question would be to betray not only the Reich, but one's very blood. In this world, even family life would be redesigned. Marriage would not be a matter of love, but of eugenics. Couples would be matched by officials to maximize the strength of the Aryan bloodline. Women would be celebrated only for their role as mothers of the future army. Those deemed unfit to reproduce, whether due to illness, disability, or ancestry, would face forced sterilization or elimination. The natural diversity of humanity would be stripped away in pursuit of a cold, uniform vision of perfection.
Economy and labor, too, would serve this vision. The Slavs who survived extermination would exist only as slaves, tied to the land, forced to harvest grain and mine coal for their masters. Across the fertile plains of Eastern Europe, German settlers would build villages, fortified not against invaders from abroad, but against uprisings of the starving populations they had displaced. Factories would churn not for consumer goods or prosperity, but for weapons and machines of war. Even in peace, the Reich would prepare endlessly for conflict, for expansion, for the day it could challenge America itself. And yet, beneath this iron order, tensions would remain. The Slavs, scorned as lazy, the Spaniards mistrusted as unreliable, the southern peoples barely tolerated as second-class allies. Propaganda would speak of a united Europe, but in reality, resentment and division would fester. The Reich would rule not as a partner, but as a master, and every nation would be reminded daily that their survival depended solely on German favor. Such was the vision of a continent remade not in diversity and cooperation, but in rigid hierarchy and fear. It was a world where even hope would be dangerous, where dreams of freedom would be passed in whispers and stamped out with blood.
As the decades passed under this alternate future, the Reich would entrench itself deeper into every corner of life until a very idea of resistance seemed impossible. Children born in Berlin, Paris, and London would grow up saluting the same flag, taught from their earliest days that history began with the rise of the Reich and that everything before it was weakness and decay. The memory of free nations would fade, replaced by myths carefully crafted by propaganda ministries that told citizens they were living in the pinnacle of civilization. But even in such a world, the human spirit would not vanish entirely. Whispers of defiance would survive in underground gatherings, secret schools, and forbidden texts smuggled across borders. In the forests of the East or the mountains of the Balkans, remnants of cultures long declared dead would keep their languages, songs, and prayers alive, waiting for a moment to rise again. The Reich could dominate armies and cities, but could never fully erase the yearning of people to be free. Internationally, the balance of power would shift in ways difficult to imagine. With Europe under one banner and resources flowing from conquered lands, the Reich would become the single greatest power on Earth. The United States would stand as its only true rival, separated by oceans but locked in a struggle for global influence. Every nation from South America to Africa to Asia would be forced to choose between alignment with Berlin or Washington. The Cold War of our real history would be replaced by a far darker confrontation between democracy and a racial empire. Technology, too, would evolve under this system, but not in the same way. Where our world pursued innovations for comfort, communication, and exploration, theirs would remain focused on militarization and control. Science would be shackled to ideology, with projects designed not to expand human knowledge, but to expand the power of the state. Instead of satellites for global communication, there would be weapons in orbit. Instead of medicine for all, there would be genetic experiments meant to refine the master race. By the 21st century, such a world would be unrecognizable to us. A vast empire stretching across Europe and Asia, patrolled by German armies, governed by fear and sustained by slavery. The arts of freedom, democracy, and equality that shaped our reality would be nothing more than distant memories, erased from textbooks and forbidden in conversation. Humanity itself would be divided into rulers and ruled, into masters and slaves, into those considered worthy and those condemned to vanish. And yet, by reflecting on this nightmare, we better understand the fragile miracle of the world we inherited. The victory of the Allies did not simply end a war, it preserved the possibility of a civilization built on freedom and human dignity. It gave rise to the international order we know today, however flawed it may be. Had history taken another path,
Our lives, our families, our very identities would be unimaginable. The story of what might have been is not just a curiosity, it is a warning. Civilizations are not guaranteed, progress is not inevitable, and freedom must be defended in every generation. The shadow of this alternate world reminds us why the sacrifices of millions in our timeline mattered, and why the choices we make today still shape the future to come.